Hello there everyone, my name is Crazy Caleb and that rustling of chess pieces that you hear at the beginning of the bomb is 1D chess. This is the way the module looks. It's got a wooden background, and the way that this works is essentially there will be a series of 8 to 11 tiles, a blackboard overlaid on a wooden background, which represents the amount of moves that you as white must move in order to actually checkmate the king, essentially the king on the other opposing side, in this case black. You will always be white in this instance. You will always be white in this module, and you will always be up against black. That's the way that this module is going to work. So, what we need to do here is we need to figure out a mate in whatever number we have on the board here. In this case, mate in 6. Mate in 7 is a possibility. I believe there's like a mate in 5 potentially, but most of the time you're going to find out it's mate in 6 or 7. So, what we're going to be taking a look at here is we're going to be trying and figuring out how exactly we can do this mod here. And this module is notorious for being a bit weird and wacky, because to solve this module you must beat Rustmate, a computer chess engine, at their own game. You cannot use more moves than the blackboard specifies. Losing or drawing, the game will incur a strike and reset the module. So that's one thing that we need to be very careful at. We need to be very careful at how this works. And the best way to visualize this is to start from where the king is at. And essentially what's going to be moving is it's going to be moving in a counterclockwise direction. But this all represents one individual line. And I'm going to be using the interactive today made by Luminosity Tim, I believe, right? Yes. Interactive made by Luminosity Tim to be using this to help visualize exactly what's going on in the module here. Instead of on just on the module where it's sort of moving counterclockwise, essentially. That's the thing that we're looking at here. So now the game rules are actually fairly simple to how chess works, but with a couple different tweaks, essentially. So 4 to 8 chess pieces are divided into white and black sets. The game is played on a one-dimensional board of 8 to 11 squares, designated A through K, left to right, and any corner turns on are treated as straight lines. So in this case, if we take a look at what we have here, we have a bunch of different movements. And if we were to, for example, move the rook, and in this case, if we take a look here, so say, for example, if there was no black rook here and we were trying to move the white rook, the rook's movements are in any odd number of spaces forward or backwards. And what we can do is we can move this 1, 2, 3 spaces over to this square. Normally, the rook in chess would be moving simply horizontally or vertically, but in this case, we're only going to be moving an odd number of spaces for the rook. So in this case, 1, 2, 3 spaces, this spot would suffice. Remember, it's all on one line. This is why it's called 1D chess. So let's get right into the module here. So now the other movements are fairly straightforward. King pretty much stays the exact same. It's one space forward or backwards. The knight is going to be the one that you really want to pay attention for, because this one makes things a bit wacky when it happens to be on the opposing side, especially. So the knight can move 2 spaces forward or backward, but can jump over another piece. This is the only piece on the board that can jump over one other piece when it's trying to move. So for example, let's take a look here. There does not appear to be one that we can actually use right now, but let's say if like the knight and queen were swapped, essentially, and the queen decided to move forward, for example, if it was right here, like the queen were headbutting each other. The knight would be able to move from this white square where the queen is at currently right now, over to this white square in this corner, where the knight currently is right now, and that would be fine because it's jumping over the bishop. That's the way that this works. Now for pawns, it can move 1 to 2 spaces forward towards the opponent king. Now with pawns here, normally when pawn movements, in normal chess, what you would be able to do here is only move the pawn forward by 2 spaces in the first move. However, with the pawn here, you can actually move 2 spaces whenever you want to, though keep in mind that the pawn will be involved in some strategy later on. Next up for bishop, bishop can move any even number of spaces forward or backward, does not jump over though. Rook is odd number of spaces forward or backwards, and queen is, of course, any number of spaces forward or backward. Queen is the most powerful piece, obviously, as you can tell, and that's going to be what we're looking at here. These movements are pretty straightforward with how with how they normally move on a normal chess game, but there are a couple modifications, the big ones being the bishop, the rook, and the knight itself. So that's going to be what we're looking at, and the pawn, I guess you can technically say. So now what we want to do here is with the interactive, we want to set how many squares are actually on the board here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So let's set that to 9 squares. And I don't really worry about the movements because most of the time you can figure out how the movements work just by kind of playing around with it. But I will set it to 6. And now let's set up the board. So we have the king here. We've got our white pieces here. We've got the knight. We've got a rook. We've got a rook facing it. Then we leave space. Then we have a pawn, and then we have a king that we need to get. So now let's save this position because this is going to be very important to come back to. And now what we want to do is we want to try and start calculating how we can get this, how we can checkmate this king. This is where things get a little bit interesting. So let's take a look and let's see exactly what we want to do here. So I think the idea here of getting rid of this rook is going to be forced. We can either take it with the knight or we can take it with the rook. This one's going to be a bit of an interesting example. And I believe the idea here is we can try and get rid of our knight and rook by sacrificing it to the pawn so that we can get the queen forward and instantly take the king. That might be the idea here. And there really is no good way to go about this other than trying to go guessing and checking just to see what we can essentially do here. And that's going to be kind of what we're doing here. Note that it is advised not to be sort of like piece capturing, like a piece capturing frenzy sort of deal, where essentially what you're going to be focusing on is capturing the rook and capturing the pawn and yada yada. Do not do that, because that's not the way that this module works, and that's not what the module wants you to do. There is a lot of strategy involved into this and how to get the actual solution. So let's take a look and let's see what we can do. So at this point, I kind of like the idea of just kind of going down a path and see where it actually leads. So perhaps what we can do here is we can start with the knight, or maybe the rook. Let's start with the rook because it's right here. We capture the opposing rook here, and basically what's going to happen here is it's guaranteed to be essentially pushing the pawn forward. We don't know exactly what yet, but it's going to be either 1 or 2 spaces. Now, I am inclined to believe that it would be 2 spaces because of the fact that it wants you to capture this pawn here, because that would force, I believe, it wouldn't technically force a stalemate, because it would be able to move, if we were to move the pawn forward here, it wouldn't be forcing a stalemate. It would be putting the king in check, but it effectively will put that there, and that's not really what we wanted this to do. And what we would have to end up doing here is we would have to end up moving our rook back, and that's not really what we want to do. Perhaps actually what we want to do is we actually want to sacrifice our rook here. Leave the king with no other options and actually sacrifice the rook. If we were to move it forward, in this instance, it would either be forced to move back, and if we move it forward, it's forced to take it. It has no other options. Now, perhaps what we want to do is we want to try and start galloping our knight over to the India square. We can absolutely do this. So we do this, it is forced to move back here. We do this, it's forced to move forward, do this, and then that's mate. But is that enough moves? And is this what the actual idea of what Rustmate is going to respond to this? Is this how Rustmate is going to respond? We don't know. So that's what makes this thing interesting. So let's actually count how many moves that took. So we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's not enough. That's not mate in 6. So this is not going to work. So perhaps what we can do now is we could perhaps capture with the knight, for example. Or there perhaps is another pathway that it can go down. So if we capture with the rook, it has the possibility of moving the pawn forward by 1. Perhaps what we can do is move the rook forward. It can maybe try and move the king forward, force it to sack it, and that's not going to be way too many moves at that point. It's not going to be a mate. So I believe what we're going to have to be doing here is we're going to try and capture with the knight. I think that this is going to be the pathway that we need to take. We're going to try and capture. We're going to try and move our pawn forward here, and perhaps what we want to do is, I like the idea of moving the queen forward. We need to get this queen out in the open so we can actually capture the knight here, and this is what makes this thing a little bit difficult to do. This is notorious for being very tricky. It's why it's 16 points on Twitch Plays, for a very good reason. And it's a lot of guessing and checking, just trying to find a path that might work. We don't know exactly what the Rustmate is going to try and do here, which is why it's advised to get sort of a general idea of what we're looking at here. In some cases, we might be a bit more guaranteed with how we actually go about the solution here, but in many cases, it's not that easy. It's really not. So let's continue looking, perhaps. When we take with the knight, it moves the pawn forward by 2. Maybe we move the pawn, maybe we move the knight forward, or perhaps just move the queen forward. Trying to get some activity here with this pawn to take the rook and the knight, and that's really interesting how this is not going to help us. We could obviously pose a check here, forcing the king over here. And if we capture the pawn, which we actually can't right now with the way that the rook is positioned here, we actually might be able to move the rook forward here, sack that, because either what's going to happen here is we get rid of the knight by the king taking it, and then we're going to end up losing probably the rook hopefully soon. Oh, I think I actually see the path here now. Yes, I think I do. Wow, okay. Yes, hold on. Okay, so let's go back to the save state. So we captured with the knight. It likely will move 2 forward. If it moves 1 forward, I don't think that that's going to help us. And in this case, if it moves 1 forward, I think we want to move back 1. But if it moves 2 pieces forward, what we can do is we can then move the knight over here. The king is forced to come over here. Now what we're doing here is we're giving a choice of what we want to capture here. If it captures with the rook, if it captures the rook with the pawn, we can then take with the queen. That's going to cause a stalemate, though. That's where problems arise. So it's very interesting. But if we don't capture with the pawn, for example, if we go here and we go here, if the pawn decides not to capture and it captures the knight, well, that's just it, because it's going to move forward, and we're protecting the rook with the queen. It's going to be forced to move back into the corner, and just like that, we have checkmate. That's one way of doing it. Now, with this, if we do this, and it decides to actually capture the rook first. We don't want to capture with the queen, because what that effectively does for us is it puts the king in stalemate. It can't capture the knight. It can't move back because of the fact that knight moves 2 spaces forward or backward, and that's not going to work for us. We want to win. So if this happens to be the case where we go down with the pawn, it's going to be capturing with the knight instead, and then whatever king move it does, we're going to essentially move the queen forward, and then we're going to move the knight back, and that's going to be checkmate. Now, it's likely that that's not going to happen. What's going to probably happen is we take it with the knight here, and it's going to probably move 1 space forward. That's probably what I'm expecting, and it's not the nicest move to be coming across, and that's what kind of concerned me a bit. So, and the problem with this is the fact that, number 1, I have an idea. So if we were to actually capture with this, it forces the king to move out. If we were to move the rook back, for example, in this case, for example, say to Echo or Charlie. So if we were to move to Charlie, for example, or Echo would be probably a better move. It's going to be forced to capture the knight, and then we just checkmate it, forcing it back, forcing it back, forcing it back. I think we have enough tactics to go along this path. I think we want to capture with the knight. I think it's safe to say that we want to capture with the knight, and we have a couple of responses with how we want to capture whichever pawn move that we want to do here. So let's do this. We capture with the knight. It does indeed move 1 forward. This is very important. This is exactly why we did this. So now we're going to capture the pawn with the knight. Okay, it moves forward exactly as you expected because it's forced, because the king would be in check. Now let's move the rook forward. It's forced to capture, yep. And now we move the rook forward for the rest of the way. Just like that is a solved module. So it is a lot of guessing and checking. It's kind of keeping ideas in your mind of what moves you can do. And as you can see, we just solved the module. So we essentially forced it back with the rook being 1 space forward. In this case, keep putting it in check until the king has no more moves and it's back into the corner. That's what we wanted to do here. The queen was protecting. This is the reason why the queen was so important here, because it was protecting the rook and allowing it to move forward. We wanted to get rid of that knight. So this is the way how the module behaves. And as you can see, this takes a long time to do, but it's overall not too bad. So there are a lot of cases where there will be forced examples, where there will be forced moves in like the first couple moves. So that's going to be very important for us to do. So let's take a look and let's see what we can do here. So in this case, this one's going to be a bit different. because I can already see how things might be a bit interesting. And the squares is actually significantly less. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to decrease by 1. And this is definitely a lot more cramped, I will say, for certain. So I have a couple ideas, and I can already pretty much see kind of what the tactics are. So it's going to be pawn and the king over here. Now, it's 6 moves again. So in this case, let's get the move going. Now, based off of the way that we're currently looking right now, we have no choice but to capture the rook with the queen. There is no other moves that we can essentially do with any of our other pieces. This is guaranteed to have happen. I can immediately interact with this on the module with confidence in there. And I expected to take it with the pawn. Yes, that makes sense. So now, what it's trying to do is it's trying to make me stalemated. It's trying to get me to stalemate it. If I were to take it with... I can't actually take it with the rook. And I'm actually going to be forced to move it forward here. And what it's going to try and make me do is it's going to probably try and make me stalemate. Because what he's going to try and do is he's going to try and move his king forward in order to prevent me from actually getting... in order for me to prevent from actually me taking the pawn. Because if I move the rook forward, it's preventing the king from moving at all. We don't want that to happen. So let's move this back. Let's put the pawn here. Now, this is kind of where you want to play a little bit of like a waiting move in a way. What you're trying to get it to do is you're trying to move, let's move the king forward, the queen forward, for example. We're going to force the king to move somewhere else. Either the pawn to capture it or the king to move. That's going to be essentially what we're after here. And then we're going to essentially back it into a corner. This one is a much easier example to do. So let's force the rook forward 1. It does indeed do that. Let's move the queen forward. It moves it back. Be very careful. If we were to essentially if we were to capture the pawn right now, and if it was in this position, it would be check. That would work for us. It's not preventing any moves from going anywhere. That's good to go. And now we essentially back it into a corner like we did in the previous example. And just like that is a solved module. Let's take a look at one final one. And it's very important to, it's very important. The best advice that I can give you for this mod is expect the worst, but prepare for the best. If prepare your best, expect for the worst. That's the way that this works. So, because a lot of the times they're going to be doing a bunch of wacky moves, but there is indeed some way how to counter every single move that it does. And in this case, that first example that we saw was very tricky because there obviously was multiple paths that we can go down with either the rook or the knight to capture the rook, whichever way we did. With this one, there really was not many options that we could actually do. This one is a much simpler example, and we were able to just simply follow that path down. So let's take a look and let's see what we can do with this example here. So this is an mate in 6, so let's reset this entire thing. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 squares. So we've got 9 squares here. Set it back to 9. And let's set the board up. So we've got the king, we've got the knight, we've got the pawn, we've got the queen, we've got a space, we've got the black knight, we've got the black bishop, we've got the black queen, and we have the black king. Okay, this will be interesting. And one thing that's very concerning is the fact that we're just straight up going head on into a knight. Now, the idea here could be we're just trying to get rid of pieces. We want to keep that queen alive, I think, for as long as possible. This would be a nice position to have. Obviously, the pawn would be very useful, too, to simply just move it forward and put the king back into the corner. That would be quite nice, too. So, this is where things get a bit interesting. And I actually have a proposal of how we can actually go about this. I think this might be the best move that we can actually do here. So we take the queen with the knight. We take the knight with the queen. The bishop... Actually, no, we cannot take the bishop. We cannot take the knight because of the fact that this is going to cause problems for us. The bishop cannot jump over other pieces in this case. That alone would not allow any moves for black to move. This is going to cause problems. So we're actually going to be forced to move here. Let's go back to the original position. I forgot to actually save this original position too. Let's save it here. So, if we were to capture the knight, the bishop would not be able to move at all, and none of the other pieces are able to move either. So this is actually going to cause problems. We actually have to move the queen to echo. There is no other option for this. That's the way that this works. The knight is then going to move over to here, and now the bishop is actually threatening to take the queen. And now I like the idea of taking the knight here, and the bishop's going to move forward here. The queen takes it. The queen takes it back because it's pinned. The pawn takes it. It still has a move that it can do, and then we continue backing it up into a corner. That's the way that I can see this working. Because remember, pawns can move 1 to 2 spaces toward the opponent king, and this applies during the entire game. So, we know that for a fact that we're going to be forced to move our queen here. That's the way that this works. I could see us taking the knight, and then it's going to be forced into the bishop. Okay, now, with this in mind, it's going to be forced to take, the queen is actually going to be forced to take the bishop, forced to take the queen, because of the fact that if the queen happens to move anywhere else, it's mate. The king cannot move right now. So, let's take with the bishop, let's take with the pawn, it moves there, we move 1 space forward, we move 1 space forward, and just like that, is mate, and the module is solved. As always, thank you guys for watching. Remember to stay crazy, stay cool, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.